Volodymyr Zelensky came to become Ukraine's president. We all know now, of course, without any experience in politics whatsoever, although he's often compared to Donald Trump as somebody who came out of the blue, wasn't expected to be elected. That's not completely true, because Trump was involved in Republican politics for quite a while. Zelensky had zero political experience, and just in his first month or so in office has shown himself to be extremely naive, particularly on questions of what constitutionally in Ukraine the president has a right to be involved in, and that includes many areas he didn't even realize that the president's not involved in. For example, the president does not control the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the police in Ukraine, and he does not control the government on questions of utility prices. The Ukrainian president is primarily involved in issues such as foreign policy, national security, defense policy, and those kinds of areas. But in those areas, he's probably, I would say, even more naive, romantic, uninformed than he is on domestic affairs. And maybe because he's an Eastern Ukrainian Russian speaker as well, he's extremely naive about issues to do with Russia. But the most important area that he's been criticized about is his attempt to be very democratic. I guess it came from the right place. In his proposal to hold referendums on very complex issues such as a peace agreement on the Donbass. This has been heavily criticized by civil society organizations, by foreign observers, Western governments, and also Ukrainian political parties. It simply is nonsense to expect that an average citizen in any country is going to be fully acquainted with all of the nuances, will be able to read thousands of pages of documents to make a good decision about whether a peace agreement is viable or not. It's simply not possible. There are many, many complexities around the war in the Donbass, and often in a referendum, people will vote not with their head, with their hearts. They'll vote not on the entire issue, but on one particular issue. For example, if you've had a family member killed or a friend killed, a brother in the war, you're going to be voting in a very emotional way. You're not going to be voting in a very pragmatic or rational way. Also, in a democracy, you vote for members of parliament, local councils, presidents, heads of state, who are supposed to deal with these complex issues on your behalf. And all of these people, whether they're members of parliament or presidents, have a huge number of advisors, experts, and others that they can rely upon to deal with these complex issues. The average citizen does not have that and does not have the time to go through it. So, for example, how many Ukrainians, and I'm not surprised, will have read through the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement? We're talking up to 1,000 pages. I somehow doubt it. But that's not typically peculiarly Ukrainian. When Western Europeans have had referendums on very complex issues such as the Lisbon Treaty, which created a Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the European Union, again, or the new EU Constitution, we were talking about hundreds or up to 1,000 pages of documents, and again, nobody really read those pages, and those referendums did not really result in any clear views. Similarly, in the case of, for example, Canada, the US, I mean, how many Canadians or Americans, if it was put to a referendum, would read all of the documentation surrounding the NAFTA agreement? I somehow very doubt it. Certainly, Donald Trump has not even bothered to read it, and so I doubt whether the average citizen simply has the time or the inclination to go through all of these documents. We're talking about very complex issues and a lot of work and a lot of understanding of what's going on. But of course, the most and best example of why referendums are not good ways to deal with complex issues. I mean, you can deal with relatively simple issues of the referendum, such as, for example, something on a local level, or even a referendum on whether you want to join NATO or the European Union, because it's simply a choice of yes or no. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But on something very complex, then the best example of why that's not a good idea is, of course, the Brexit referendum in 2016 in Britain. The Brexit referendum has been a complete disaster from day one and has led to political paralysis in Britain, has led to the collapse of the two main establishment parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. The Conservatives came fifth in the European elections yesterday. Labour Party came third. The Brexit Party, the far-right party, came first. When the referendum was proposed in 2016, there was no serious debate about what this entailed. There was a very simplified question in the referendum. There was a lot of lying, particularly on the part of the pro-Brexit camp, a lot of exaggeration, and again, that's probably likely in a similar type of referendum in Ukraine. We know a lot in this day and age about things like fake news, Russian information warfare, and such like, and that is likely to sway people. But in the case of Britain, the Brexit referendum showed that anything like that is going to lead to a polarization of society. And what you've had in particular since then is the inability of the British Parliament to decide what kind of Brexit, because of course the simplified question in 2016 was, do you want to leave the EU or not? Well, that's fine, but on what terms? Nobody asked anybody in 2016 on what terms you wanted to leave. There are multiple ways of continuing a relationship with the EU. People have referred to the Canada-EU relationship, the Norwegian-EU relationship, staying in the customs union, not staying in the customs union. None of this was decided, so it has led to perennial quarrels, and I don't understand how there is even a way out of this, of this paralysis. So the only positive side to the Brexit is that it's led to a massive jump in popularity of the EU throughout Europe, and these elections held last week showed that it was the highest turnout ever for European parliamentary elections, and it led to a big growth in particularly including young people coming out and voting for an election which was never usually popular. It usually received 25–30% turnout, but this time it was over 50%. Why? Because everybody looked with horror at Britain and said, my God, that's the last thing we want in my country. So if you want to show something negative about referendums, be my guest. Go and take a look at what happened in Britain with Brexit. Such kinds of situations simply open up Pandora's boxes of multiple future problems, including polarization, the rise of the far right, fake news, lying, and all sorts of things. So I think President Zelensky is very wrong to look at this issue of putting a peace agreement to the Ukrainian public. This is something that should be decided by the president, then ratified and discussed by the Ukrainian parliament, or rejected by the Ukrainian parliament, and then it will stand and be put to the test in the Ukrainian election, the next Ukrainian election. It cannot be decided by people who have no knowledge about this, or who will vote in a very emotional way or a very warped way because of information that they've read. I don't think that, on a final note, I don't think that President Zelensky will be very successful. He has, of course, put himself for this. He's campaigned on this question that he wants to bring peace to the Donbass. But simply, the kind of peace that Mr. Putin is willing to offer Ukraine is only a peace that is tantamount to capitulation of Ukraine. And that only includes the Donbass. It does not include the Crimea, which is simply something that Putin says is not on the table for negotiation. So Zelensky is already only discussing half of the problem. He's only discussing the Donbass and not the Crimea. And anyway, he's discussing it at a time when Putin continues to lie and say that Russia's not involved, that this is a civil war. It's not a civil war. So I somehow doubt that it'll even get to a referendum, and if it does, then I think Zelensky will reap the whirlwind from that down the road, and I don't think it'll lead to good consequences. Putin's desire is to have two Donbass entities that Moscow currently controls inside Ukraine as autonomous units, vetoing Kiev's domestic and foreign policy. Will Zelensky agree to that? I doubt it. For Ukraine to drop its ambitions of joining NATO and the EU, how will Zelensky be able to do that when it's enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution, which requires 300 members of parliament to change the constitution? And for basically Ukraine to be a kind of federalized, weak state, staying within Russia's sphere of influence. If Zelensky even began to go down that road, it would be the end of his political career and his presidency. So I don't think it'll get as far as a referendum. And certainly he'll be playing with fire if he's moving in that direction anyway. So I, on a final note, will say Brexit, a Brexit-style referendum is not something that is something that Ukraine needs at this stage in its development, and it certainly doesn't need. It needs Ukraine's president to do a bit of nighttime reading and to actually become a bit more professional in the way he's handled such questions on foreign policy until now. Thank you. I prefer to have a naive Vakarchuk than a naive Zelensky. That would be a good subtitle to a video blog.